Exactly. If you were human, you would know what I said.
What's the capital of Texas?
Austin.
No, the capital of Portugal is Lisbon. The capital of Indonesia is Jakarta.
Yes, it is. But what is the capital of Vietnam?
Quebec City is the capital of Quebec.
That's correct. What is the capital of Peru?
The capital of Iceland is Reykjavik.
How much wood would a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood?
A woodchuck could chuck no amount of wood, because a woodchuck can't chuck wood.
But if a woodchuck could chuck and would chuck some amount of wood, what amount of wood would a woodchuck chuck?
I suppose a woodchuck would chuck as much wood as a woodchuck could chuck before becoming fatigued if a woodchuck could chuck wood.
Incorrect. A woodchuck would chuck as much wood as a woodchuck would chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood.
73 characters.
A woodchuck would chuck a lot of wood as a woodchuck could chuck wood.
Woodchuck Norris chucked woodchucks with the woodchuck's wood.
Chuck Norris would chuck the woodchuck and the wood.
How much wood could a woodchucker chuck if a woodchucker could chuck wood?
He would chuck as much wood as a woodchuck could if a woodchuck could chuck wood.
But if a woodchuck could chuck and would chuck some amount of wood, what amount of wood would a woodchuck chuck?
But a woodchuck can't chuck wood because a woodchuck can't chuck wood.
But should the woodchuck chuck wood? If a woodchuck could chuck wood, could a woodchuck have a reason chuck wood?
What if the wood chucked by the woodchuck was chucked by Chuck Norris?
But what if it couldn't shoot what a woodchuck could chuck?
A woodchuck would chuck as much wood as a woodchuck would chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood.
Woodchuck Norris chucked woodchucks with the woodchuck's wood.
But what if the woodchuck wanted to chuck wood like a woodchuck would?
The woodchuck should resist the urge to chuck.
And would a woodchuck chuck wood, if a woodchuck could and should chuck wood?
Just because a woodchuck can chuck wood doesn't mean it shouldn't.
But a woodchuck can't chuck wood, so that question is without meaning.
But if a woodchuck could chuck, if a woodchuck chucked wood, would a woodchuck?
But I just said, a woodchuck can't chuck wood.
But how much wood could a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood?
As much wood as a woodchuck could chuck.